World War II, one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. But what about the stories that didn't make it into the history books? Buckle up, because we're diving into the untold and frankly hilarious tales. Let's start with Operation Fantasia. No, this wasn't a secret mission to smuggle Mickey Mouse. The plan? To scare the pants off the Japanese by using glowing foxes. Yes, you heard that right. The OSS believed that the Japanese people were superstitious and that seeing ghostly, glowing foxes would terrify them into surrender. They even developed a special chemical that would make these foxes glow in the dark. The idea was to release these glowing foxes near Japanese villages at night, causing mass hysteria and, presumably, ending the war through sheer ridiculousness. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Operation Fantasia never got off the ground. The foxes were not cooperative, and the whole plan was abandoned. It turns out that training foxes to glow and then expecting them to wander into enemy territory is a lot harder than it sounds. Now, if you think glowing foxes are a bit too wild, let me introduce you to the Emu War of 1932. Technically, this happened before World War, but it's too bizarre not to include. Australia was facing a different kind of enemy, 20,000 emus. These birds, which are basically modern-day velociraptors, were ravaging crops in Western Australia. What did the government decide to do? Send in the army. Armed with machine guns, soldiers were dispatched to deal with the emu menace. But the emus proved to be surprisingly resilient. The soldiers found that the emus could take several bullets without going down, and their sheer numbers made them impossible to eradicate. After weeks of trying and failing, the military withdrew. Defeated, the emus had won. And yes, Australia lost a war to a bunch of flightless birds. The moral of the story: never underestimate an emu. Moving back to World War II proper, let's talk about the Battle of Los Angeles. In February 1942, just a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the people of Los Angeles were on edge. So, when unidentified flying objects were spotted in the sky one night, panic ensued. Believing they were under attack by the Japanese, the city's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, unleashing over 1,400 shells into the night sky. The city was lit up like a 4th of July fireworks show, and the barrage lasted for several hours. The only problem? There was no enemy. The attack was later blamed on a combination of war nerves and possibly a weather balloon. Yes, it's always the weather balloon, but for one night, Los Angeles turned into a scene straight out of a sci-fi movie, with terrified civilians thinking the apocalypse had arrived. The only thing damaged was the city's reputation, and maybe a few rooftops from all those shells. Speaking of odd battles, let's not forget the time the British Navy fought against icebergs. During the war, shipping routes in the North Atlantic were critical, but they were also threatened by German U-boats and apparently icebergs. In 1943, a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike proposed a solution: build massive aircraft carriers out of ice. The idea was that ice, being buoyant and abundant, could be used to create floating fortresses that were nearly indestructible. This idea wasn't just a flight of fancy. The British actually began working on a prototype called Project Habakkuk. They even built a small-scale model in a Canadian lake. The prototype was a block of ice reinforced with wood pulp, which made it incredibly strong. It was also incredibly slow, incredibly heavy, and, well, it melted. The project was eventually abandoned, but not before Winston Churchill had reportedly said, "The Pequot will be ready for sea by next summer." Spoiler, it wasn't. Now, you might think a floating iceberg aircraft carrier is as crazy as it gets. But let me tell you about the time the British tried to turn Adolf Hitler into a woman. Yes, this was an actual plan devised by the British intelligence services. The idea was to smuggle estrogen into Hitler's food to make him more feminine, less aggressive, and presumably too preoccupied with his hair to continue the war. The plan was part of a broader strategy of psychological warfare, aiming to destabilize Hitler's mental state. It's unclear how close they came to actually carrying it out. But the fact that someone seriously suggested dosing the Führer with female hormones just goes to show how desperate and creative the Allies were getting. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, this plan was never executed, so we'll never know if a hormonal Hitler would have traded in his swastikas for some sensible heels. On a similar note, the Allies also considered dropping glue on German troops. The idea, known as Operation Sticky Bomb, was to cover enemy soldiers in a super adhesive substance, rendering them immobile and easy targets. It sounds like something straight out of a Looney Tunes cartoon. And unsurprisingly, it didn't get very far in the planning stages. But just imagine a battlefield full of angry German soldiers stuck in place like a bunch of furious action figures. It's a sight that would have been both tragic and hysterical. And now, for perhaps the most absurd tale of all. The time a bear became a war hero. Wojtek was a Syrian brown bear adopted by a group of Polish soldiers stationed in Iran. The soldiers took care of Wojtek, who became their unofficial mascot. But Wojtek wasn't content with just being a mascot. He wanted to get in on the action. During the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy, Wojtek actually helped his comrades by carrying heavy crates of ammunition. The bear became so beloved by the unit that they officially enlisted him as a private in the Polish army, complete with his own paybook and rank. Wojtek eventually rose to the rank of corporal, and after the war, he retired to a zoo in Scotland, where he lived out the rest of his days as a celebrity. Not many bears can say they've seen combat and been promoted, but Wojtek was one of a kind. The next time you hear someone say they're as strong as a bear, just remember that there was once a bear who was literally as strong as an army. Before we wrap up, let's not forget the ghost army that wasn't really a ghost army. In 1944, the US Army created a special unit known as the Ghost Army. Their mission? To deceive the German forces about the location and strength of Allied troops. But here's the kicker. They did it with inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and sound effects. The Ghost Army would set up these inflatable tanks and jeeps, broadcast phony radio chatter, and play recordings of troop movements to make the Germans think there was a massive army where there was none. The unit was so successful that it's estimated they saved thousands of lives by diverting German forces away from real battle zones. It's probably the only time in history that a bunch of hot air saved lives on the battlefield. So the next time you think of World War II, remember that it wasn't all about grim battles and serious strategy. It was also about glowing foxes, estrogen-laced Führers, and inflatable tanks. History, as it turns out, is not just written by the victors, but also by the pranksters, the eccentric geniuses, and sometimes by a bear with a taste for battle. There you have it, some really bizarre tales of war. Armed with this knowledge, imagine how entertaining you'll be at your next party. You're welcome. You can thank us by liking and subscribing, please.